The first thread. Ethan Cade had never believed in signs. At 35, his world was built on logic, routine, and deadlines. He ran a small architecture firm, prided himself on precision, and avoided anything that smelled of mysticism. The word synchronicity might as well have been a brand of incense to him, something sold in dimly lit shops, with crystal pendants and drum catchers. But that morning, something cracked. It started with a red kite. He had been walking to the corner cafe, head buried in an email, when a flash of scarlet drifted past. It was strange, no children nearby, no park in sight, yet this kite, frayed and bright, tumbled in the wind and landed almost at his feet. He bent down to pick it up, half amused, half annoyed, and saw something scribbled in black marker along the edge. "Trust the wind." Odd, a child's doodle. He left it on a bench and went about his day. But 2 hours later, as he reviewed blueprints in his office, his assistant knocked. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "Says it's urgent." The visitor was a wiry old man in a leather jacket. He introduced himself simply as Calder. "I need an architect for a restoration project," he said, sliding an old photograph across the desk. Ethan glanced down and froze. In the photo was a seaside house, white walls weathered to gray, a wraparound porch, and there, on the porch railing, hung a tattered red kite. Ethan tried to play it cool, but his voice wavered. "Where is this?" "Mariner's Point," Calder replied. "An old property I've been asked to restore. I need someone who can see more than just the structure." Ethan almost laughed. See more than the structure? He was a man of clean lines and budgets, not omens. Still, something gnawed at him. Against his better judgment, he agreed to meet Calder at the property the following weekend. That night, sleep was elusive. Ethan's mind kept circling the coincidence. A kite in the street. A kite in a decades-old photo. He told himself it was just a trick of pattern recognition. Psychologists had a term for this: apophenia, the human tendency to see connections in random data. It wasn't fate. It wasn't magic. It was just weird. But the next day, it happened again. While waiting for his coffee, he glanced up at the cafe's chalkboard menu and saw that the quote of the day read, "Trust the wind, it knows the way." The same phrase from the kite. His chest tightened. He didn't mention it to anyone. What could he even say? "Hey, funny thing, the universe seems to be leaving me fortune cookie messages." 2 days later, Ethan found himself Googling synchronicity. The articles led him to Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who coined the term. Jung described synchronicity as a meaningful coincidence, two or more events connected not by cause, but by significance to the observer. A scarab beetle in a dream, then a real beetle in the room. A thought of a friend, then their sudden phone call. Ethan read late into the night. He discovered that Jung had been friends with Einstein, who approached the mystery from physics, and Nikola Tesla, who saw the universe as patterns of frequency and vibration. Different disciplines, same implication. Maybe life wasn't as random as it appeared. But knowing the theory didn't make it easier to swallow. The architect in him still demanded proof. That proof came sooner than he expected. The house at Mariner's Point. The air smelled of salt and pine when Ethan arrived. The old house stood alone against the sky, weather-beaten, but still proud. Calder was already there, leaning on the porch railing like he'd been waiting for years. Inside, the place was a time capsule. The sheets covered antique furniture. Sunlight slanted through stained glass in patterns that felt deliberate. As they walked through, Calder kept saying odd things. "Listen to what the house wants," he murmured at one point. "Buildings have memory," at another. Ethan took notes on structural repairs, but his attention kept drifting. It was in the upstairs study that something stopped him cold. On the desk lay a weathered leather journal. The first page was blank except for one sentence, written in looping ink. "When the wind calls, follow." The words seemed to hum in his chest. 3 times now. The kite, the cafe, and this. It was too specific, too personal, to be random. That night, Ethan sat in his car outside the house long after Calder had left. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving under the surface of his life, like a current pulling him somewhere he couldn't see. Maybe it was chance. Maybe his mind was primed to notice patterns because of that first odd encounter. The reticular activating system. He'd read about it online. A filter in the brain that decided what information to let in based on what we focused on. Still, the messages didn't feel like something he was generating. They felt like they were arriving. The stranger in the diner. On the drive back to the city, rain forced him to stop at a roadside diner. He ordered coffee and pie, trying to ignore the growing unease in his gut. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes, brought his plate and lingered. "You're not from around here," she said. "No, just visiting for work." She nodded slowly. "Mariner's Point, right?" Ethan froze. "How did you?" "Just a guess," she said, smiling faintly. "People who go there usually get messages." He stared at her, unsure if she was serious. "Don't look so rattled," she added. "It's not bad, just pay attention." Then she walked away, leaving him with a chill down his spine and more questions than answers. As he drove home, Ethan felt something shift. The logical part of his mind still fought to explain it all away. But another part, deeper, quieter, was starting to listen. And that's when he saw it. A lone red kite, caught high in the branches of a roadside tree, flapping against the storm. "Why the signs find you." Later, lying in bed, Ethan found himself thinking about something he'd read. That synchronicities often appear when we're at a threshold between jobs, relationships, or identities. They're a nudge, a breadcrumb trail from the unconscious, or perhaps from something greater. He didn't know what threshold he was standing on. His life was fine, stable, predictable. But as he drifted into sleep, the wind rose outside, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely in control, and he wasn't sure if that was a bad thing. The pattern in the glass. Ethan didn't expect the signs to follow him home. Yet, over the next week, they multiplied like ripples from a stone tossed into still water. The numbed. It started with 3:33. He woke in the middle of the night, not groggy but fully alert, and his eyes went straight to the glowing red digits on his alarm clock. 3:33 a.m. Weird, but not meaningful, at least not the first time. But then it happened again the next night, and the next, always the same, always without an alarm or noise to wake him. By the fourth night, he Googled it. Articles offered contradictory meanings. Ascended masters are guiding you. One said, your mind, body, and spirit are aligning, said another. Skeptical as ever, he almost closed the tab. Then a line caught his eye. When you see repeating numbers, ask yourself, what was I thinking or feeling right before I noticed them? That night, when 3:33 lit up again, he realized he'd been dreaming about the house at Mariner's Point, standing on its porch, wind snapping at his clothes, as something called his name from the sea. The glass blower. On Saturday, Ethan needed a mental break. He wandered into the city's art district, where small shops huddled together like mismatched puzzle pieces. A glassblower's studio caught his eye, molten colors twisting and hardening into fragile shapes. He stepped inside, drawn to a single piece on display, a blown glass sculpture shaped like a spiral, red and gold, with a tiny kite fused into the swirl. He almost laughed at the absurdity. Beautiful, isn't it? Said a voice behind him. The glassblower was a woman in her 40s with hair tied up in a scarf, flecks of color on her hands. She told him the piece was called Trust the Wind. She'd made it last month, inspired by a dream that felt like a message. Ethan bought it without knowing why. As she wrapped it, she added, sometimes art chooses its owner, not the other way around. The thread pulls tighter. That night, he set the sculpture on his kitchen table. Its spiral caught the light from the window, throwing red-gold reflections on the wall, reflections that, oddly, reminded him of the stained glass in the Mariner's Point study. He didn't sleep well. The wind outside had picked up again, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the restless dark, he realized he wasn't just noticing these connections, they were finding him. And then, in the quiet between gusts, another thought surfaced. If these are messages, I need to know who's sending them. Calder's map. The next time Ethan met Calder at the house, the old man was spreading a large, weathered map across the kitchen table. These are the original blueprints, Calder explained, though Ethan could see they were more than that. Notations in the margins, tiny sketches, symbols that didn't belong to any architect's legend. What's this? Ethan asked, pointing to a spiral drawn in the corner. Ah, Calder said softly. That's not part of the design. That's the mark of the first owner, a man named Elias Ward. He believed the house sat on a crossing point, a place where things from the inside and outside touch. Inside and outside of what? Calder gave a wry smile. Depends who you ask. Some call it the mind and the world. Some call it the physical and the unseen. Either way, Elias kept records of strange events here. Coincidences, patterns, dreams that bled into waking life. Ethan's pulse quickened, like her synchronicities. Calder's eyes flicked up. So you've been having them. It wasn't a question. The physics of connection. That night, Ethan dug deeper. He read about quantum entanglement, the phenomenon. Where do particles remain connected, so that the state of one instantly affects the other, no matter the distance? Einstein had called it spooky action at a distance. The analogy wasn't perfect, but something in it resonated. What if people, events, and places could be entangled in ways we didn't yet understand? He found another concept, the reticular activating system RAS, the brain's filter for information. Once primed by a thought, goal, or belief, it lets through anything related and discards the rest. Logic said the RAS was why he kept noticing kites, wind, and spirals. But logic didn't explain the timing, or the fact that these symbols seemed to lead somewhere. The woman in the photographs. Ethan had been studying the house's photos again when he noticed something new. In one shot of the porch, just behind the kite, a figure stood in the shadow, a woman in a long coat. Her face turned slightly toward the camera. The detail was so faint he might have missed it, if not for the way her scarf fluttered in a whine that shouldn't have been captured in a still image. Something about her was familiar. The next day, he brought it up to Calder. The old man frowned. That's Leora Ward, Elias's granddaughter. Disappeared in 1973. No one ever found out where she went. Ethan felt a shiver creep up his spine. Do you think? I think, Calder interrupted. You've stepped into something that doesn't happen by accident. The bookshop. 2 days later, Ethan ducked into a second-hand bookshop to escape a sudden downpour. He browsed aimlessly until his hand landed on a slim, sea blue volume wedged between thicker tomes. No title on the spine. Inside, the first page read, Leora Ward, Mariner's Point, 1972. The book was part diary, part dream journal. She wrote about the house's moods, the wind's strange behavior, the way certain days felt woven together with others, as if time folded. She described finding red kites in impossible places, and on the last entry, a single line. When the wind calls again, I'll follow. The breaking point. That night, Ethan dreamed vividly. He stood on the house's porch at twilight. The wind rose, carrying the scent of salt and pine, and far out over the water, a single red kite danced against the horizon. A woman's voice, Leora's, he somehow knew, whispered, follow. When he woke, it was 3:33 a.m. The choice. Ethan realized the signs weren't random curiosities anymore. They were directional, pulling him toward something. Whether it was danger, opportunity, or madness, he didn't know. He made a list, trying to convince himself he was still in control. Kite in the street, trust the wind. Cafe quote, same phrase. House journal, when the wind calls, follow. Glass sculpture, title trust the wind. 3:33 a.m. dreams, always of the house. Leora's diary, kites, wind, disappearing. The logical part of him whispered, confirmation bias. The other part, the one growing louder, said, the pattern is real. The storm. A week later, a storm warning rolled over the coast. Calder called, asking if Ethan could come to the house to secure some of the older windows before the wind turned violent. Ethan almost said no, but something, that same inner pull, made him agree. By the time he arrived, the sky was a bruised purple, and the wind had already begun to howl. Inside, the air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. As he worked, he noticed the spiral reflections from the stained glass seemed brighter than before, shimmering like water. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement on the porch. He turned, and there she was, a woman in a long coat, scarf fluttering, watching him. Her face was pale but calm, her eyes steady. Leora. The name escaped before he could stop it. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped back, and the wind surged, rattling the windows, shaking the very bones of the house. And then she was gone. Ethan staggered outside, scanning the porch, the yard, the shoreline. Nothing, only the wind, and out over the water, a single red kite struggling against the storm. The realization. Back inside, Calder found him staring out at the waves. "You saw her, didn't you?" the old man said quietly. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Calder nodded. "Then you know it's time. The house chose you." That night, as the storm battered the coast, Ethan understood something he couldn't explain. The signs weren't just guiding him to a mystery, they were inviting him into it. He just didn't know yet what it would cost. The crossing point. The storm had passed by morning, but the air still hummed with the memory of wind. Ethan sat at the kitchen table in Mariner's Point, staring at the spiral in the stained glass as sunlight poured through. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Leora's face, calm, deliberate, almost expectant. The key. Calder shuffled into the room with 2 mugs of coffee and something clenched in his fist. "This," he said, setting the object down, was Leora's. It was a brass key, tarnished with age, the head engraved with the same spiral Ethan had seen on the blueprints. "She left it on my porch the day before she disappeared," Calder said. "No note, just the key." Ethan turned it over in his hand. It was heavier than it looked. "What does it open?" he asked. Calder's eyes twinkled. "That's for you to find out." The door beneath the house. The basement of Mariner's Point was a place Ethan had avoided. The steps were steep, the air damp, and the smell of salt lingered as if the sea itself pressed against the stone walls. Near the far corner, behind a stack of crates, he found a narrow wooden door. The spiral on its iron lock matched the engraving on the key. It turned with surprising ease. Beyond was a short tunnel, the walls lined with rough planks, the floor sloping gently downward. The air grew cooler as he walked, until the tunnel opened into a small circular chamber. In the center stood a wooden table. On it, a leather-bound journal, a brass compass, and a folded scrap of paper. Leora's last words. The paper was brittle but legible. "Ethan, if you're reading this, the pattern found you too. The key only appears when the next one is ready. This place is a crossing point. Think of it like a tide, sometimes high, sometimes low, and when the tide is high, you can step between what is and what might be. Trust the wind. It will take you where you need to go. But remember, once you cross, you can't always choose when to return." The signature was a looping Leora word. The compass. The compass wasn't normal. Instead of pointing north, its needle spun lazily, then stopped, not at a direction, but at the spiral etched faintly into the face. When Ethan turned, the needle moved again, as if leading him toward something. He thought about leaving it, about climbing the stairs, getting into his car, and driving away. But deep down, he knew he'd never be able to ignore the pull. The cliff. The compass led him out the back door, through the overgrown garden, and down a narrow path to the cliffs overlooking the sea. The tide was unusually low, exposing jagged rocks and a stretch of sand rarely visible. As he descended the path, the wind picked up, not violent, but insistent, threading through his hair and clothes like a guiding hand. At the base of the cliff, the compass needle stopped, pointing toward a rock arch that framed the horizon. Beyond it, the sea shimmered strangely, as if light were bending in ways it shouldn't. The crossing. Ethan stepped through the arch. The air shifted instantly, cooler, sharper. The sound of the surf dulled, replaced by a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in his bones. Ahead, the shoreline was both familiar and not. The house was still there, but the windows blazed with light, and a red kite danced high above the roof. And on the porch, waiting, was Leora. The meeting. She looked exactly as she had in the storm, coat, scarf, steady gaze. But here, the colors were sharper, the air more alive. "You came," she said, her voice carrying over the wind. "I don't know how," Ethan admitted, "or why. You were chosen," she said simply. "The pattern finds those who can see it, who can follow it without getting lost." Ethan stepped closer. "What is this place?" "It's the other side of the crossing point. The world here runs alongside yours, but the lines touch in places, moments of synchronicity. Kites, wind, numbers, they're markers. When you notice enough of them, the door opens. The choice." Leora's eyes were kind, but there was weight in them. "I didn't leave your world because I wanted to vanish. I left because I was needed here. The wind called, and I followed." Ethan frowned. "So you can't go back?" She hesitated. "Not easily. Not without breaking the balance." Each crossing changes things on both sides. She held out the compass. You can return now if you choose, but if you stay, the work becomes yours, watching the tides, guiding the next one when the time comes. The understanding. Ethan thought about the kites, the glass sculpture, the diary, about waking at 3:33, standing on the porch in his dreams. He realized the signs hadn't been random at all. They'd been a conversation, not with fate exactly, but with a system older and more intricate than he'd imagined. And somewhere deep inside, he knew he'd been walking toward this moment for longer than he'd realized. The decision. He looked out over the strange, bright sea, then back at Leora. "I'll stay," he said. Her smile was small but warm. "Then you'll need to learn how to listen." The wind rose again, and in it, Ethan heard something new, not just a call, but a language. Years later, if you walk by Mariner's Point now, you might see a man on the porch, watching the horizon as a red kite dances in the wind. Sometimes he waves at strangers, and sometimes, if you're the right kind of person, you'll find a small spiral-engraved key waiting on your doorstep the next morning. If that happens, don't ignore it. The pattern may have found you.